Everyone knew Frank Sinatra. The man wasn't just a singer, he was the soundtrack of the 20th century. He crooned while soldiers shipped off to war, he swaggered in Las Vegas with the Rat Pack, and he made mob bosses and US presidents alike sweat with a single phone call. Sinatra wasn't a star, he was the star. A man whose voice could silence a nightclub and whose temper could silence a room. He had Grammys stacked like poker chips, Oscars tucked away like spare cufflinks, and affairs splashed across tabloids that made America's moral guardians clutch their pearls. The spotlight was his natural habitat, and he devoured it whole. But buried beneath all that flash and smoke rings was a quieter truth. Sinatra had children, 3 of them to be exact. The eldest daughter, Nancy, turned her name into hit records and miniskirt fame. Tina, the youngest, slipped behind the camera, shaping her father's legacy from the shadows. And in the middle stood his only son, Frank Sinatra Jr., the heir, the one saddled with the impossible task of being born with his father's name, his father's face, and a voice that could never be just his own. Imagine growing up not as a kid, but as the Sinatra Kid. School plays? Forget it. Your dad isn't just the guy clapping in the audience. He's the guy who sold out Madison Square Garden last night. Class presentations? Doesn't matter what you say. Your last name already gives everyone a script to recite. For Frank Jr., there was no such thing as a normal childhood. His bedtime lullabies weren't fairy tales. They were the muffled sound of reporters waiting outside the family gates, hoping to catch a photograph of the little prince of swing. And it wasn't just the press. Sinatra's world was dripping with glamour and danger in equal measure. Mobster acquaintances, White House phone calls, screaming fans climbing onto stages. This was the background noise of Frank Jr.'s early life. Every birthday party came with the risk of paparazzi lenses. Every innocent teenage date carried the burden of the Sinatra reputation. Being Frank's son wasn't a blessing, it was a lifetime assignment you couldn't quit. The irony, of course, is that Sinatra Sr. himself was a storm of contradictions. The man who sang "My Way" was rarely satisfied. His temper exploded in restaurants, his affairs filled gossip columns, his friendships with dubious characters raised federal eyebrows. Every headline about him had ripple effects, splashing straight onto his family. And while his daughters were allowed, to a degree, to shape their own identities, Nancy with her go-go boots, Tina with her quiet defiance, Frank Jr. was forever typecast before he even opened his mouth. He wasn't just a son, he was supposed to be the continuation of a legend. But that spotlight burns, and when it falls on someone who never asked for it, the results can be strange, tragic, and haunting. For Frank Jr., the story began as one of privilege and promise, yet it bent into something more complicated. The weight of expectations, the scar of a violent kidnapping, the long shadow of a father who could never be matched, and the quiet, persistent effort to be known not as Sinatra's son, but simply as himself. What really happened to Frank Sinatra's only son? Frank Sinatra's story wasn't just a rise, it was a meteor strike. One minute he was a skinny kid from Hoboken with a microphone, the next minute he was rewriting what it meant to be famous in America. His voice was silk over smoke, turning every broken heart into a sold-out ticket. He wasn't merely adored, he was worshipped. Teenage girls fainted at his concerts before Elvis was even a thought. His early stardom gave him nicknames like The Voice and Swoonatra, nicknames that sound like marketing gimmicks until you realize they were just literal descriptions of what happened when he walked into a room. But meteors don't burn that bright without fallout. Sinatra lived in headlines, not just the arts section, but the front page. He was tied to the mob by whispers and handshakes, photographed in smoky back rooms where politics and crime blurred into cocktail chatter. His marriage to Nancy Barbado unraveled in very public fashion, a casualty of his affairs, his temper, and his hunger for more. And yet, Even in scandal, Sinatra had a way of bending the story back toward himself, like gravity pulling satellites into orbit. That's the world Frank Sinatra Jr. was born into in 1944. Picture it. His father was already a household name, his voice bouncing through every radio in America while the country fought a world war. His birth wasn't a private family affair, it was an event. Newspaper clippings announced it, fans sent gifts. The Sinatra family wasn't just a family, it was national property. From the very beginning, Frank Jr. was less a baby, more than a headline waiting to be written. The Sinatra shadow wasn't just metaphorical, it was tangible, heavy, and inescapable. By the 1950s, Sinatra's fame was a hurricane. He was reinventing himself as a film star, an Academy Award winner from here to eternity, a Rat Pack kingpin drinking martinis with Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. Crowds followed him like he was royalty. Everywhere he went, the flashbulbs followed. And where there were flashbulbs, there were shadows. And that's where Frank Jr. was left standing. Imagine being 10 years old and trying to play baseball in the yard while your father's face is on magazine covers screaming about affairs with Ava Gardner. Imagine being 14 and already knowing that your dad is on the FBI's radar. Imagine stepping into high school and having your teachers know more about your father's scandals than your own grades. For Frank Jr., privacy was a myth. Identity was borrowed. Childhood was stolen by proximity to a man who had no room for being just dad. And yet, Frank Jr. didn't run from it. He leaned in. Music, after all, was in his blood. But this decision to follow his father into show business wasn't freedom. It was a life sentence. Every note he sang, every stage he stood on, every hotel lounge or concert hall came with the same question. But is he as good as his old man? Spoiler, no one was ever going to be. That was the trap. The shadow wasn't something he could outgrow. It was something he would spend his life navigating. But here's the cruel twist. Fame isn't just a shadow, it's a magnifying glass. For Frank Jr., it meant every stumble was amplified, every misstep immortalized. And the darkest example of this came in 1963, when Frank Jr. was just 19 years old. He wasn't on the front page for his music. He was on the front page because he had been kidnapped, held for ransom, the son of the most famous man in America, stolen and used as leverage. It was a headline that shattered the Sinatra myth of invincibility, and it branded Frank Jr. forever as not just the son, but the victim. The irony is almost poetic. Sinatra Sr. built his career on controlling the stage, the spotlight, the story, but he couldn't protect his son from the chaos that orbiting a legend inevitably creates. The shadow wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. And for Frank Jr., the kidnapping was only the beginning of a lifetime spent trying to be both his father's heir and his own man. Because behind the legend of Sinatra the Giant was a quieter, more haunting legend of Sinatra the Son.
Frank Sinatra Jr., born Francis Wayne Sinatra on January 10, 1944, in Jersey City, New Jersey. From the moment he entered the world, there was no hiding who he was. Newspapers announced his birth with fanfare usually reserved for a royal heir. And in a way, that's exactly what he was, the crown prince of swing, heir apparent to the most famous crooner on earth. Except, unlike real royalty, there was no palace to shield him, only paparazzi, bodyguards, and a father who belonged to the public almost as much to his family. Frank Jr.'s childhood was less a Norman Rockwell painting and more a case file in how fame warps normalcy. His parents' marriage cracked under the weight of Sinatra Sr.'s affairs, splitting in 1951 when Frank Jr. was just 7. He bounced between his mother's more stable home and the chaotic orbit of his father's world, where movie sets, Vegas stages, and mafia-tinged dinner parties were all part of the scenery. At school, he wasn't just Frank, He was Sinatra. Imagine your classmates already knowing the gossip column version of your family tree before you even learned long division. By his teenage years, Frank Jr. decided he wanted to sing. Some might call it destiny, others masochism. He studied music seriously, even learning conducting and composition, determined to prove he wasn't just a hand-me-down echo of his father. But destiny, or maybe irony, had other plans. No matter how hard he tried, the comparisons were suffocating. He had a pleasant voice, sure, smooth, capable, professional. But when the world expects the voice 2.0, pleasant sounds like failure. Every review carried the same backhanded compliment. He's good, but he's not his father. It was like running a marathon where the finish line kept moving just out of reach. And then came December 8th, 1963, the night everything changed. Frank Jr., just 19, was performing at Harrah's Lake Tahoe when two men broke into his hotel room, tied him up, and kidnapped him. The son of Frank Sinatra had become ransom bait. America froze. The FBI scrambled. Sinatra Sr. reportedly was so frantic he offered to pay any amount, no questions asked. The kidnappers demanded $240,000, a small fortune at the time, but pocket change for a man like Sinatra. The money was delivered, and after 2 harrowing days, Frank Jr. was released near Bel Air. But here's where the nightmare twisted into humiliation. Almost immediately, rumors spread that the kidnapping had been staged, a publicity stunt to launch Frank Jr.'s stalled singing career. The FBI had to publicly confirm it was real, but the damage was done. For the rest of his life, that shadow lingered. Was he a victim, or was he the butt of a cruel joke? Imagine being 19, traumatized, and then being accused of masterminding your own abduction. That scar never faded. Frank Jr. soldiered on. He kept performing, touring relentlessly, often in supper clubs and casinos, where his father's ghost seemed to lurk behind every cocktail glass. He even served as his father's musical director in later years, conducting orchestras and keeping the Sinatra machine running smoothly. That role suited him better. It allowed him to prove his technical skill without inviting direct comparisons. Still, it was a life spent in service to someone else's legend. He once admitted, with a mixture of bitterness and resignation, a famous father means that in order to prove yourself, you have to work 3 times harder than the guy off the street. Romantically, Frank Jr. never found the fairy tale ending. He had relationships, rumors, and even paternity suits splashed in the press, but no long-term marriage to steady his legacy. Perhaps it was by choice, or perhaps being a Sinatra meant never fully escaping the transactional nature of love and fame. By the 1990s and 2000s, he was largely relegated to nostalgia circuits, crooning the songs that made his father immortal. The cruel irony? The more he sang those songs, the more invisible he became, swallowed by the echo of the original voice. In March 2016, while on tour in Florida, Frank Sinatra Jr. died suddenly of a heart attack at age 72. He was still working, still chasing stages, still performing in the long twilight of his father's shadow. His death barely made front pages, a few obituaries tucked between celebrity gossip and political scandals. The final indignity? Even in death, Frank Jr. was a footnote to his father's saga. And yet, his story lingers like a half-forgotten song drifting from a jukebox. Imagine being born into a name so heavy you couldn't put it down, not even at your own funeral. Imagine carrying that last name. Would you keep it or bury it forever?